Hello, my name is Robin Baker. Today's date is Tuesday, July 30th, 2019, and I have the privilege of interviewing for the Veterans History Project Marian Jean Setter, and we are in Great Falls, Montana. And Ms. Setter prefers to go by Jean. So, hello, Jean. Uh, Thank you so much for sitting down with me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Okay, so can you tell me what you were doing prior to you um, joining the service?
Well, mostly I was getting my education as a nurse. I graduated and got in October of 1944, and by the time I had taken my state boards and got the reports back, and another slight delay over the Christmas holidays, and also due to a delay in getting my physical exam, I didn't actually go on duty until February of 45.
Okay, and how old were you at that time?
20,
23.
23.
Okay, so at that point in 1945, Pearl Harbor had happened 4 years before, so you were still in school during that time.
Yes, I was the first I had a 5-year program, and that was the first year that I was in the hospital. The
Okay.
program consisted of 2 years of college and then 3 years in the hospital.
Okay. And so, what made you choose to go into the service? Do you have other family members that were in the service?
Well, I had some uncles that served in World War One, and a grandfather that served in the Civil War.
Oh, wow.
On the northern side, I might add. However, there was a feeling at that time everybody wanted to get into service, or almost everybody, and there wasn't any question about it. You just wanted to go.
Okay.
Because it was to serve the country. We were united. I suppose there were people who thought we shouldn't be in it, but that must have been very rare.
Okay. And where did you do your training? Where were you living at this? You grew up in Lewistown.
No, I didn't grow up in Lewistown. I was born there, but I grew up on a ranch near Utica,
Oh, okay.
which is about 50 miles west of Lewistown.
Okay.
I graduated from high school in Hobson,
Oh,
and after I graduated from that, of course, I started my nursing school, and I went to Bozeman.
Oh,
I
okay.
took their collegiate program
Okay.
to become a nurse there.
okay.
And the 3 years in hospital was part of that whole scheme of nursing, the
Okay.
whole program. So, and then in the very short interval between, well, actually just before I actually graduated, and the time when I went into the service, I worked as a head nurse at Warm Springs at
Oh,
the psychiatric hospital.
okay.
I had been there for as a student to get my psychiatric experience, and they asked me to come back and as a head nurse while I was waiting to go into the service.
So, when did you know you wanted to go into the service?
Oh, I don't know. From the time that I started nursing, or even
Okay.
before that.
Okay. Okay. So, you joined in February of 45. So that was about 6 months, 8 months actually after D-Day. So,
Yeah.
I mean, you,
No, it wasn't after D-Day. It was there was about from February until September that was war. The war was not over till September
Right.
after I had joined.
right.
Yeah.
So, So, what did your mother think when you joined the Army?
My mother,
Yeah.
well, she didn't express herself greatly. I suppose, like most mothers, she probably didn't want me to go far away, and joining the military, of course, always one thinks there's some risk that is incurred with not to be found in other types of occupation.
Sure.
She probably felt that, but she didn't express herself strongly one way or another.
Okay. So, you were commissioned in 1945
Right.
and went in. What was it like joining the service then and being in the military?
Well, everybody had to go to basic training to begin with. So that was my first assignment. I took a train to Tacoma, Washington, and had my basic training there. Actually, the particular group of people that arrived at a certain time had to wait a little while for the next course to start. So in the meantime, we just worked in the hospital there. And that was my first exposure to war casualties, and I was really impressed
Okay.
by some of them. I thought it sort of confirmed the fact that I thought I had done the right thing.
Oh, wow. Okay. So, you had to go through a regular boot camp.
Yeah, we learned how to march, and we had riflery, and we shot pistols, and we went through a gas chamber and
Yep.
all the usual stuff.
Okay. What was that like for you?
It was all new and exciting. I wasn't really worried about
Yeah.
the gas chamber, for instance, or
Right.
anything else like that.
Until they told you to take your mask off. Do you remember taking your mask off?
Yeah.
So you felt the effects of, it wasn't lethal, but still not pleasant. So, where did you go after boot camp?
My first assignment after that was to Hammond General Hospital, which is located near Modesto, California. And it was a general hospital. We had medical and surgical patients. Many of them had been injured, some of them months before. Well, once in a while we get new casualties or newly injured patients too, but most of them were there for a longer period of time and treatment.
Okay.
And I don't know, it was what I remember about Modesto was it was out, or about the hospital. It was by itself. There was no other military installation there, and Modesto was our nearest town, and our tents, there was a cantonment type hospital with wooden barracks, were out in the middle of the grape arbors, or grape
Vineyards.
yeah. And it was terribly hot in the summertime, and we didn't have air conditioning.
Oh. So that was pretty rough. Yeah. What did you have? So you were just in a kind of a camp then.
Well, we lived in wooden barracks,
Right.
too.
What did you have for food? Did they have a mess hall or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We had a mess hall, and we had, well, there were repetitious to some extent, like any institutional type cooking is bound to be that way. I don't recall anything specific about it except that it was nourishing, and we got whatever we needed.
Mm-hmm. So how many nurses were? I'm sorry. Was this a military hospital? Or,
Yeah.
Oh, it was a military hospital. Okay. So how many nurses did you serve with?
I don't really know.
How big was the hospital?
I couldn't quote the number of beds that we had, but there were a number of different wards.
Oh, okay. So it was fairly large.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And how long were you there?
Oh, well, not very long, really. I think I arrived there in April or in the spring, and the war ended at the end of August. Actually, it ended shortly before that, and then it was officially over, I think, wasn't it the 2nd of September or some date like it. And about that time, I was transferred then back to Fort Lewis. This was right at the end of the war, because I was flying, and when I got on the plane, the war had not ended, and I got off of the plane and it had ended.
Oh, wow.
Anyway, at Fort Lewis, I was assigned to a numbered hospital, and I can't remember if it was a general hospital or a station hospital, but it was numbered. So we were preparing to go with the invasion of Japan. And I remember being told that they expected even more casualties than took place on D-Day in Europe.
Wow.
But we didn't, fortunately, have to do that because the war ended then.
Yeah. Boy.
And so we were at Fort Lewis, and we had camped out in tents out in the wilder parts of Fort Lewis, while we're assembling people who would be assigned to the particular. There was more than one hospital that was training there. There were half a dozen, I think, at least, and we were assigned our personnel, and we're trying to establish contacts and organize it. Well, then when the war ended, there was no use for those hospitals, and so everybody was reassigned then to someplace else. And that reassignment was what took me back to California, to San Francisco this time, when I was assigned to that hospital train
Okay.
that we talked about.
Can you explain that a little bit more then, too?
Well, many people were unaware that much of the transport of medical personnel during war was by train. Even in the countries where there was fighting, they would use trains too. But here in this country, there were ports where patient came in. San Francisco was one of the ports, and there was something on the East Coast, I think, in Brooklyn had one, and I think there was another in South Carolina, but I'm not sure about that. Anyway, patients would be evacuated by ship into the U.S. at one hospital or another. And then Letterman General Hospital was the one in San Francisco. Letterman Army Medical Center is probably the correct terminology. And then from there, they have to be distributed to other places, depending on partly on their injuries and partly where their home address was, because they could try and put people where they're somewhere near their hometown, so
Right,
if they could
right.
possibly do it that way. So that's where the trains came in there. And my first trip was to West Virginia. There was a resort there called White Sulphur Springs, and the Army had taken that over as a hospital during the war, and so the first load of patients that I took out with the train was where we went.
Oh, so you actually, they loaded a train and then you, as a nurse, treated them along the journey.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, and these were American POWs that had been held by the Japanese.
Yeah, most of them were, that occurred, of course, not until after the treaty had been signed and that they had been able to, it took a little while to get established how to do it and,
Right.
and all.
Right.
There were other patients prior to that, the regular casualties from the results of the fighting in the
Sure.
South Pacific were there. But I didn't get in on much of that because I didn't get there till after the war ended.
So on these trains, were they only POWs, or was there other wounded on there as well?
I don't recall, no, I think there were, to begin with, we took only, all the patients would be going to the same place. And they were all POWs
Okay.
to begin with that I can remember.
Okay.
Then later, I do recall going to Florida with a load of patients one time who were not all prisoners either. They were a mixture
Okay.
of casualties and
Huh.
I don't remember exactly what all.
So how was that for you then? I mean, that must have been a fairly long train ride.
Yeah.
Did how was that treating these POWs?
Well, they were the cars had been fitted out with bunks, so they had beds to sleep in, and if they needed medications or treatments along the way, they got them. The nurses took care of them. There was usually a corpsman or two assistants as well that went along, and if they needed physical help in bathing or going to the bathroom or managing crutches or something, it was all assisted for them.
Yeah.
And the nurses had one little bunk by themselves, a roomette or whatever you call them, a separate place to sleep.
Mm-hmm. But just dealing with these men that had probably, I mean, I can't imagine the conditions that they had been held prisoner in.
Well, almost all of them were malnourished.
Oh, of course.
And had lost much weight. I recall one man who was probably 6 feet tall or about that, and I think he weighed less than 100 pounds.
Mm.
And,
So, did you have many conversation? I mean, were you able to socialize with them much? Were they talking to you about their situations, or?
they didn't talk a lot about them. They were mostly all excited about being back home again
And safe.
seeing their families.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh. Wow. So then you went down to Florida on the train.
Yeah, that was one trip I made,
Okay.
and there were others. I went to San Francisco. No, we started from there. I went to San Diego with one load of patients, and then to Fort Sam Houston and San Antonio. And another time, I know I had a cousin who had been injured on Okinawa. He was in the Marine Corps, and he had been in a hospital, in a Navy hospital in California, and I had gone to see him there. And he had been transferred to a military hospital in Brooklyn. And so I was taking this load of patients to Brooklyn, and I thought I'd have a chance to see my cousin while I was there. And then we got in there and found orders waiting, moving us immediately to some other place.
Oh.
To pick up other patients. Because about that time also some of the hospitals were being closed to condense the military assets.
Oh.
And with no casualties coming in constantly like that was before, they didn't need, they're trying to save money, consolidate the hospital.
Okay. So, and this all happened in your first enlist or in your first time in the military. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the only part of it.
Oh, what else? So, because you were only in for 4 years, your first, um,
Yeah. Well, after the hospital train assignment, which I think that the train units mostly all closed, and about that time because there really wasn't any more need for them. Now, the Air Force at that time did not have the facilities for transporting in mass like they did later because the Air Force really wasn't a separate
right.
unit until 1947. But after that, I had signed up to go overseas, and it happened that the overseas assignment that I got was to Korea to serve with the Army of what was then called the Army of Occupation, later became known as the Army of Liberation.
Mm.
I think that to begin with, people didn't realize that Korea had been an independent kingdom for hundreds of years, but had been taken over by the Japanese at the early part of the 1900s. And they just thought it was part of Japan,
Mm-hmm.
so it was considered the Army of Occupation. And until the Koreans proved that they really were not sympathetic with the Japanese at all.
Right, right. So, what was that like, being in Korea?
Well, we were fortunate. I went to the 34th General Hospital, which fortunately had taken over some permanent installation. Had been a academy for training constabulary, so it was not altogether unsuitable to use as a hospital, and it was permanent fixed buildings. We didn't have to live in tents or anything like that.
And what part of Korea was that? What
Right.
part of Korea?
We were about 25 or 30 miles north of Seoul,
Oh,
toward the border, but we were a considerable distance from what was the dividing line between north and south at the time was the 38th parallel,
right.
and we were on the way from Seoul up to the parallel,
Okay.
but closer to Seoul than
Okay.
we were to the parallel.
Okay, okay. And you were there for how long?
2 years.
Oh, wow. Okay. And what was life like for you there?
Well, the patients were all military. Well, we did have a few Koreans sometimes that we would take. And the usual type of casualties that you get in an army of occupation, in traffic injuries and epidemics of this and that, strep throat, scarlet fever, malaria.
Yeah.
Sometimes you'd have a whole or a whole ward full of malaria patients. Some of them having severe chills at the same time. The next fellow in the next bed would be sweating so much that you had to put a fan on him to cool down.
Yeah. But what was your, let me back up a little bit and ask, do you feel like your training at school prepared you for your military career?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So that was.
Well, it doesn't prepare you for every single thing that you might encounter, but you know the general principles for things, and you can always adjust.
Okay.
And sometimes the adjustments are kind of amusing. For instance, my roommate went to empty the hot water bottles so she could replace them with hot water and found out they'd been filled with coffee. Because that was all they had that was hot at the time.
Well, there you go. A little cream and sugar and you're fine. How was life as an Army nurse?
Well,
I mean, can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, getting along with the Army doctors and
oh, you get along with Army doctors just like you would in a civilian hospital. You know, establish working relationships, and um, you know what your job is. If you're an OR nurse, or what to report on your patients on a ward, what they need, and you need to tell the doctor about them and things like that.
and were you more in the OR or were you on the wards more?
I'm sorry?
Were you in OR or were you a ward nurse?
No, I didn't have OR. Well, I had OR as a student,
Right.
but I didn't
Okay.
work in OR. I have worked emergency room where you get some OR experience too.
Yeah.
And but there's many different specialties in nursing. You have a lot of orthopedics in the military, as you'd expect.
Mm.
But we had OB and pediatrics as well in various hospitals
Right.
where I was.
And did you have a specialty?
No, not really.
So you were
I worked medical. I worked surgical. I even delivered 2 babies once.
Wow. Wow.
One got there before the doctor did, and the other one, well, same thing really. But
So let's see. So you were in Korea, and then was that where you ended your first tour? I mean, your first.
no, I had one subsequent assignment, and that was to Fort Ord, California.
Oh, okay.
And I came back from Korea and went to Fort Ord. And I was there about a year, and then I decided that was when I would get out, see what civilian nursing was like, since I hadn't really worked in a civilian hospital except for Warm Springs, which is a specialty.
Right.
You know. So I separated, but as I said before, I remained in the reserve.
So so you went to Korea, and again, you're only 25 years old, probably 25 years old.
Probably about that.
Yeah, and spend 2 years there, and then come back to the United States. How was it coming back to the States for you?
Well, at the time it seemed like we were coming back to what was familiar to us. And I don't know, I think everybody I enjoyed my tour in Korea, even though there were things like monotony of eating sea rations all the time or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Did you get the opportunity to meet any civilians, Korean civilians, or go into the communities? Or,
Not on that tour. I didn't.
Okay.
I did go back later, at another time. It will come to that.
Yeah, we'll get to that. Okay.
And then I did have
Okay.
some opportunity, but
Yeah, and 25 miles out of Seoul, you must have been very rural. That must have been, there was nothing around.
nothing.
Nothing around the hospital, really, would there have
No,
been?
there really wasn't, except rice paddies.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So you came back and you got out and worked as a civilian for 2 years?
Yeah, well, I didn't work the whole 2 years
Oh.
I got a job as a clinical instructor working at the old Deaconess Hospital, but I was hired by the college. I was considered a faculty member of the college because I was doing the clinical instruction work at Great Falls at the old Deaconess.
Okay, so you came back to Great Falls.
Yeah.
And how did you like being a teacher?
Well, I did considerable amount of that. Well, it was later when I did that, but I think I sort of liked it.
Okay.
And that seemed odd to me because my mother would have loved to have me be a teacher rather than a nurse.
Oh.
But she was a teacher.
Oh, okay.
I think maybe maybe one of the things why I didn't want to be a nurse, be a teacher, was because she wanted me to be one.
Yeah.
You know how kids
Yeah.
are.
Yep. Okay, so then what made you decide to re-enlist? Well, or not
I
re-enlist,
didn't.
but
I was I was recalled to active duty because I was in the reserve,
oh,
and that's what the reserve was for, was to have this backup.
and that was when in 1951.
Yeah. Oh, I was started to say I didn't work as an instructor for the whole 2 years because my father got sick, and he was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and so the last 6 months there I was taking care of him. I just resigned, and he wanted to go home to die. And my mother and father were living in Hobson at the time, so I just resigned my job and went and took care of him at home.
Yeah.
Then he died on Christmas Eve, and so shortly after that I got my notice to return to the Army.
Wow, wow. So, so you got recalled, and what rank were you when you were discharged the first time?
First lieutenant.
Oh, you stayed as first lieutenant. Did you go back in as first lieutenant?
No, I started as a second lieutenant.
Second.
And then I became promoted. I didn't get captain until after I was back on duty again. Active
Okay.
duty.
So where did you go when you got recalled then?
I went to a camp in California called Camp Roberts. It was located between LA and San Francisco, and it was a tank training center at that time. And strangely enough, since I've been here in Grandview, I've encountered 3 people who were assigned at that camp. And that's me, because all the rest of the time most people never even heard of it. And there's one man in this college now who said he was at
Wow.
Camp Roberts.
Did they remember you?
No, I think they were at different times than when
okay.
It was we just took care of the casualties that we had there. You know, from training at a training center, you always have a certain number of casualties.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And their dependents were there too.
Yeah. Okay. And so that's again 1951. Let's try to track this down. So, where did you go after Camp Roberts?
I was asked if I would like to go to do teaching, to go back because I had a degree. They asked me if I'd like to be an instructor back at Medical Field Service School. This is at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio again. And I first said no, I didn't think I wanted to do that. And I changed my mind. And so I went and told them if it wasn't too late, I would accept it. So I did. They changed my, and I went back there and taught there for almost 3.5 years.
Oh.
In the basic nursing procedures and medical, some medical emergency procedures, and as much anatomy and physiology as they needed to. And we get miscellaneous things too from time to time, like there was a class of would-be dentists. They were probably in training in some hospital somewhere, and they went for their summer camp uh, experience in the military. And I can remember I was teaching them how to give an injection, and one of them fainted.
Nurse, nurse.
I thought, well, for a dentist, he should.
Yeah, okay. So when you were at Fort Sam Houston, were you living on base or did you live off base?
I lived off base there.
So basically you had a civilian lifestyle.
Yeah,
But-
pretty much.
Okay, okay. And so a good time? That was a good time for you?
Yes, I enjoyed that. That was a good assignment, and I liked the work. It was regular hours, and I liked the associates that I was working with.
Yeah. So basically, I mean, like civilian lifestyle, but a military job.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, there's a certain. You can't say that you separate your private life from your professional life either. There's overlap,
Yeah.
and you have to be are expected to do certain things socially, which you might ignore otherwise. You know, like going to some kind of a social event that is welcoming a new officer or a new commander or something,
Right. Right.
or some command, we call it command performance.
Yep. Yep. So was it by your choice that you left there, or did you get orders to do something else?
You mean when I left Fort Sam?
Yeah.
I got orders to go to Germany.
Oh. And where in Germany were you?
Landstuhl Army Medical Center, not to be confused with Landstuhl Air Force Base. And Landstuhl Army Medical Center is now under the divided command of both Army and Air Force.
Right.
But it wasn't at that time, it was strictly Army.
So that's still about 1955, 54?
55 to 57.
Oh, okay. And what was that like for you?
Well, I got pretty much the same kind of a job that I had at Fort Sam. I was teaching. They had a school there too. What major difference in the students was that at Fort Sam they were almost all new inductees who had been brought in to the service and were given or perhaps selected a choice to be medics. And in Europe, in Germany, they were people selected from different units that were all sent in, and they had various levels of experience militarily. And so it was kind of interesting from that point of view.
Mm-hmm.
But I enjoyed that too.
Okay. Okay. And did you live on base there, or did you live
I
out?
lived on base there.
Okay.
But we had little apartments.
Okay. And did you enjoy Germany?
Yeah, I like Germany.
Yeah.
I'm half German myself, partly.
Did you get to travel much on your own, or?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
we took our vacations just like we would have a station. We get a month, 30 days a year, and
Mhm.
you can have it divided, or you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I went to one tour that included included Italy, mostly Italy. We had to go through Austria to get there. And another time, a friend and I went to Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. And another time, to Holland, Netherlands, and once to East Germany. We went to Berlin, which was still a divided city at that time, and we toured into the Russian sector, and you could tell the difference immediately. The Russians looked like they had just been bombed recently. They hadn't done much in the way of repairing their buildings or even cleaning up the mess that was left behind.
So what was it like for you? I mean, this is 1955, so this is only barely a decade after the war. Did you have, what was it like interacting with Germans at that time?
Well, we were pretty friendly with the Germans for the most part. I don't know of any instances where there were personal conflicts between, because most of the people who had been devout Nazis and had committed crimes were either taken and or under arrest or had been arrested, and or they were seeking asylum elsewhere in some cases. And I didn't get to know a lot of Germans, but there was one German woman who worked in the coffee shops there, and she had a daughter and a son who were adults, young adults, and she invited me to go to her house, and I had dinner with them, and I knew enough German so that I could converse, well, not extensively, but enough to get along with. And I don't know, everybody seemed to be friendly enough. Landstuhl was pleasant little town.
Right, right. Okay, so so that was 2 years there.
Then I came back. I went to Madigan Army Medical Center at Fort Lewis, Washington.
To the hospital at Madigan there?
Yeah.
And what did you do there?
Well, I'm trying to think, I get it. For a while, I worked in the nursery, and they made me the head nurse in the nursery, and the chief nurse called me in, and she said, every day the pediatrician is in here complaining about something, you do something about that. So I worked in the nursery, and I guess he was satisfied because he didn't complain anymore after that. But all they needed was some organization, and they didn't even have their nursery routines written out in a way that people could locate them easily and look up and see what they were supposed to be doing.
So you got them ship shape.
I did.
Yeah.
Then after that, I was made the clinical instructor. That's another position that in military hospital you're supposed to have sort of oversee all of the educational activities that might be going on there, like in-service training programs or people who are assigned to the hospital to get some experience but don't really belong to the hospital. And miscellaneous things like that. I did that too.
So as an Army nurse, I'm assuming you had to get continuing education. There were mandatory in-services to get your, and you were in charge of those? Okay.
And not just the nurses, but the enlisted personnel as well. And there were, you have always these men who have been trained a better training than they have here for the certified nurses assistants.
Oh,
The certified nursing assistants here have 2 weeks of training. Ours were more than that.
Wow.
That's at least 6 weeks
oh,
before they could go on the ward and
oh,
help.
wow, wow, okay. Okay, so, how long was that duty at Madigan?
Uh, it wasn't very long because in '59 I had applied for and got assigned to a class that I wanted to take, advanced military nursing course was what they called it. That was back at Fort Sam Houston again. That was a 6-month course with emphasis on leadership and supervisory duties and that sort of thing. And after I finished that, I went to, I got a surprise. I thought I would be, I've forgotten now what I thought I was going to do, but what happened to me was that I got an assignment to Boston Army Base as nurse recruiter. I was really assigned to 1st Army headquarters, which were in New York, but no, you don't need to put that down, with station at Boston. But I had to stop in New York on my way to my station in Boston to sign in because I belonged to New York. And I was so worried about driving into New York City that I planned it so that I'd arrive early in the morning and probably on a Sunday. So there wouldn't be a lot of traffic, or I hoped there wouldn't be. So I got through, I stayed in New Jersey overnight, and then went through very early in the morning. I got through the Holland Tunnel. And after I got through that, I found myself on a one-way street, but was going the wrong way on the one-way street. Fortunately, there wasn't much traffic. And about the time that I thought, what the hell am I going to do now? A building on this side, a door opened, and about a dozen policemen came out. I think they had been in there getting their morning assignments or something. So they started yelling at me. I had stopped the car by that time, and I was parked to the side. So one of them came over to my car, and he walked around the car and looked at my license plates. He came back to the driver's side, and he said, where do you want to go? And I said, I'm Governor's Island, which is where their headquarters was. He said, well, I'm going in that direction. If you give me a ride, I'll get you there. So he did. He came around and got in and directed me down to Governor's Island. He didn't even ask me for my license.
So, literal police escort.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I always felt terrible after the 9/11 thing. I think those nice policemen.
Yeah, yeah. So,
Anyway, I signed in there, and then I went on to my station in Boston, where I was responsible for recruiting over all of New England, except a little bit of Connecticut that was real close to New York City. And I also had a large, big chunk of New York that's extended up into that part that goes north and protrudes into Canada.
mm,
And first I worked alone, and I would cover as many schools as I could, visiting schools of nursing and trying to recruit people. And then they sent another nurse to assist with me later, so that I didn't have to do it all myself.
did you agree to be a recruiter, or did they just said you're doing it?
No, they just assigned me that.
Oh, wow.
I think because I had had the public speaking experience of the teaching.
Right.
Might have been one of the reasons they did.
But they just sent you to advanced military nursing. So
Pardon?
they had just sent you to an advanced military nursing course. You'd think that that would put you into a leadership role in a hospital someplace, but
Well, it was a leadership role in a way because I had to deal with civilian population and collegiate programs of nursing. You know how to talk to them,
Right.
Things like that.
right.
I think I visited.
But you weren't changing bandages anymore.
No, that's right. I think that I must have visited every single hospital, school of nursing, and collegiate school of nursing in New England while I was doing it.
Wow.
And they had more hospital schools of nursing in those years than they do now. It's gone more and more toward collegiate
Okay.
programs, but
And what rank were you at that time?
I guess I was a
Okay.
captain. I can't remember for sure. Oh, I got promoted to captain when I was teaching at Fort Sam, that first assignment there. And I was, well, I might have been a major by that time,
Okay.
but I'm not sure. I can't forget when I was
Sure.
promoted to major.
So what kind of a response did you get from the nurses or the programs that you spoke to?
Well, we had pretty good response at that time. For one thing, Kennedy had been elected, and there was the Bay of Pigs thing involved, so that people momentarily at least had a patriotic feeling, and they were anxious to help serve the country, and the Army had some good programs too. We had a student nurse program. We didn't train the nurses. All we did was a financial support type thing, financial scholarship type thing. And we'd give them help with their last year or last 2 years of nursing school, for which they were obligated to return service for 2 years after they finished.
Yeah.
And that was enabled a number of young women who might not have had that opportunity otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, then, and how long were you there in Boston?
Pardon?
How long were you in Boston?
I was there over 3 years.
Wow. And did you stay a recruiter then?
No, I'm just trying to think, what did I do next? Oh, that's when I went to Hawaii after that.
Ooh, that sounds good. And returned to nursing?
Yeah.
Okay.
I did nursing, but I also had an educational responsibility there too, like at Madigan, responsible for in-service, and we had an affiliation with the University of Hawaii, where we took students in and let them get their clinical experience at our hospital. So I was I didn't plan their programs, but I sort of coordinated them. And, yeah. And of course, it was fun living in Hawaii too.
Well, tell me about that.
Oh, well, I know, you sort of fall into the Hawaiian way of living, sort of.
And where were you stationed?
At Tripler Army Medical Center, which is right in Honolulu, or right on the edge of it.
So Honolulu in the 60s.
Yeah.
Did you stay on base then, or were you out on?
Well, I lived on base to begin with, and then um, most of the senior officers, or more senior officers by that time, were permitted to live off if they wanted to, and there was a special apartment building that was built not just for Army nurses, it was for anybody, but it was attractive to, and several of the other nurses that I knew had gotten apartments there, so I did too. And, that was nice. And I got to spend a month over on the Big Island. There was a rest camp there. It was run by the Navy, but the Army was responsible for the dispensary that was there. So they'd rotate doctors and nurses over there for a month at a time so that everybody would have a chance to, or more people would have a chance to experience the Big Island. And because there were a couple of enlisted men that were assigned there anyway, all the time. So because I had had that recruiting experience, the recruiter from the Big Island had asked to have a nurse come over there so he could talk to, he could have someone talk to students who would be interested in taking nursing, some of the nursing programs. He was a Chinese man, Sergeant Tong, and so I contacted him when I went over there, and he came and got me, and we would drive up one side of the island to a meeting at some high school somewhere, and then come back on the other side of the island the other way. And he had been born and raised on that island, so he knew every little thing about it.
Wow.
And he was kind of fun to go with because he'd point out all the other unusual things that ordinary tourists didn't get to see.
Sure. And how long were you in Hawaii?
2 years.
Oh. And did you pretty much just stayed on, you didn't take any R&R any place else, did you? You stayed in Hawaii? Yeah.
Yeah.
Pretty isolated, you're almost as isolated there as any place else.
I don't know.
It's not like you can take a vacation and you can go to another island, but you don't go to Japan or someplace. You don't now.
Well, I guess you could do that, but most people didn't. They just enjoyed Hawaii while we were there.
Yeah, you're in paradise. You might as well enjoy it. So then you came back, and where did you go?
Let me think. I went to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri.
And did what?
Well, I got back in nursing. I worked the emergency room for a while, and I picked up educational responsibilities while I was there. And I wasn't there so very long. I was only there about a year, maybe not quite a year. And a friend of mine who I had met at previous assignment had become the chief of the Corps by that time.
Of the Army Nursing Corps?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And she looked back on my record as a recruiter in New England, and she thought I would be a good person to assign to the Middle East, or Middle West. So I went to Chicago after the Missouri tour. I was assigned to 5th Army headquarters there.
In Chicago, yeah.
Yeah, in Chicago.
Oh, wow.
Fifth Army recruiting, part of headquarters there.
Mm-hmm.
And there were about a half a dozen other nurses that were working in recruiting in that area, in the Fifth Army area, but they were all stationed in different places. Ethel LaRock was one. And then there was somebody in Minnesota. Ethel was in Michigan, I think.
I believe so.
And there was one in Minnesota and St. Louis, Kansas City, and Indianapolis.
Hmm.
I was sort of responsible for their work, and we're supposed to provide them with whatever assistance they needed, which I would take their appointments if they had conflicts, and see that they got all the supplies or whatever they needed for recruiting.
So you were more of a supervisor at that point?
Yeah.
Okay. Wow. And what year is this? You thinking?
Well, I went to, it followed my Missouri, must have been 67.
So well, and I was just asking because so now Vietnam is really heating up,
Yeah.
and that couldn't have been an easy job to recruit during that time. Or
No, it wasn't, because although it never happened to me, some of the men that I worked with had the experience of being booed and jeered at, and LBJ, how many kids did you kill today, type of thing, you know.
Right, especially like in a
Yeah.
urban hub like Chicago. I would imagine it would be worse.
I'm trying to think. Well, after that assignment in Chicago was when I went back to Korea again.
Oh.
I was the assistant chief nurse at the 121st Evac Hospital, which was located in Seoul or close to it. And then they needed somebody to be the chief nurse at the Evac Hospital, 7th Evac, which was located in Busan. So I was assigned down there for the last part of I was in the 121st for about 5 months, and then the rest of my tour was down in Busan.
And was that?
I was the chief nurse there.
Okay. And was that 1 year duty in Korea this time, or 2 years?
It was 1 year by that time.
Yeah. So how was it returning to Korea?
Oh, it was quite different from the first tour there. In the meantime, it become much more Americanized. And this, as the chief nurse, I did have more exposure to the civilian nursing people there, because we did have graduates or students from one of the local hospitals that would come and get some experience at our place. And in Busan, we were also responsible for having an ambulance standing by whenever they unloaded ammunition ships in the harbor, but fortunately nothing ever happened there.
Yeah.
And that was also about the time that Pope John Paul took over in the Vatican, and they were changing a lot of the thinking about uh, missions and things, and there was a young man assigned. He was assigned to a mission there in Korea, but he had been in the army before, and so he came to us for some help now and then. When he said he had to set up an operating room for a hospital that the church was building, and so we helped him out with inventories to know what to get and all of that. And so in return, he was running a big orphanage program that they had kids doing things. There was one training program for the shoeshine boys in Busan that didn't have any homes to go to. And they had another program for women who needed a job to doing sewing, and they had a hospital going where they treated leprosy. Most of the time the lepers went over to Molokai, which is founded by the Belgian father, but there were a few others there too, and there were some other programs that they had and this young man was just so interested in coordinating all of these things and with us, so we got a chance to participate in some of that sort of thing too. And that was a good assignment.
Okay, so then you came back stateside, or you came back stateside after Korea that time?
Yeah. Where did I go then? Oh, I went back to Brooke Army Medical Center, which is part of Fort Sam Houston, Texas, in San Antonio, and I was a night supervisor there for a while. And while I was a night supervisor, I had a chance to meet and shake hands with President Johnson, although he was no longer the president by that time.
Was he in the hospital for
Yeah,
some? Oh,
he was a patient.
oh, okay.
They had the main hospital, Brooke Army Medical Center, had three really big sections. The main hospital, and then there was another section where they had all of the orthopedic and some other specialties, and then the psychiatric section. And so I was the main supervisor in the main part of the hospital, and that's when I met him. I used to go up, make my rounds at night, and usually when I go up 11 o'clock when I came on duty, he was in bed, and I didn't get to see him. He had a nurse on duty all the time, two enlisted men. One was a oxygen therapist, and the other one was general things to do. And then he'd have his special service.
Secret Service?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one time when I had to call up and tell them that I was coming up on the elevator, so they wouldn't meet me with. Anyhow, when I got off, the president had gotten up. He was sitting in a chair out in the nurses' station, and all the other people were gathered around him like he was holding court, you know. They were all having a discussion of some kind. I don't know that I interrupted it. So I was introduced to him, and he started to stand up, and I said, "Oh, don't get up, Mr. President." And he shook hands.
Huh?
I happened to be dating a guy from Texas at the time, and he said, "I suppose you're not going to wash your hands forever." He didn't like Johnson.
So that was Brooke Army Hospital, how long were you a night supervisor?
Roughly a year. I wasn't there too long, and my chief nurse told me that after I'd been there for a while, that she was recommending me to go to Fort Riley, Kansas, as a chief nurse. So that's what I did next.
And what's a chief nurse? Is that more of supervisor then?
Yeah, the chief nurse is a civilian interpretation is director of nurses.
Oh, okay. So you weren't doing anything medical at the,
I didn't do actual ward work.
okay. So you were supervising the entire nursing staff at the hospital?
Well,
Or-
you do it through your other supervisors,
Right.
you know, but you're responsible for the whole thing. And I liked my commander there, and one time he said to me, you know, he said, I expressed to you how I want things done, and you go right ahead and do them the way you want to do them. I said, are you complaining? He said, no. There you go.
Yeah, yeah.
So it was a good assignment. I
Yep.
enjoyed working that. I liked that assignment. And after that, I went to William Beaumont Army Medical Center in El Paso. And I had a friend who was stationed there, not as a nurse, but who was in the medical end of the business, and I could contact him and find out, you know, what the situation was like there, whether there were any tensions or anything that I should know about. And there were none, so I thought, well, that's fine, I'll take that one. So I went, and I was the assistant chief nurse of that. It was a 1,000-bed hospital.
Wow.
And I thought that would probably be my last assignment. So I bought a house there, and it was a nice house up on the mountainside. You know, I could see down, looking over part of El Paso anyway. But then the Army fooled me, and at that time, yeah, that's when I had my cancer, and so I was treated for cancer while I was there. And that's what they got me the disability. And, anyhow, the Army fooled me, and they did move me one more time. I went now to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, in Columbia, South Carolina. And I was the chief nurse there, director of nurses. And that's where I retired from. And I got promoted to colonel, finally, at, just before I went there, because the regulations were that if you accepted a promotion to colonel, you served 2 more years in grade after accepting it. But there was a temporary halt in that regulation for the moment, because they were trying to reduce the forces, or reduction in force. And so I only served there about a little over 6 months.
Wow, and then
And I retired, and
as the full bird colonel.
yeah,
Wow. Well, that was fortuitous for you.
it was.
Yeah, but kind of, moving just for 6 months. So then had you sold your house in Texas then, or?
I hadn't.
But,
I had thought that maybe I'd just go back there and until I decided where I wanted to live permanently. But I had rented it, and so the lease was not due to expire for a while. So I just, well, I continued to rent it for a while. And then after I came back to Montana, I thought I don't want to go back to Texas anyway, so I arranged to have it sold.
So how long was it before you came back to Montana then?
Well, I came back right away after
Oh.
I graduated, after I retired from,
Okay.
from I went back to Hobson because my mother had died about 6 months before that. So I took care of her house, disposed of it, and whatever the belongings were that were there yet, and I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, but my sister and her husband had bought a house in Polson, and they wanted me to rent it. And I thought, I don't think this is a good idea, but they persuaded me to do that. So against my better judgment, I moved to Polson, and I was there about a year and a half. Polson is a nice town, and I met nice people there, but it really isn't. If my sister and her husband retire, they're going to want the house, and then where will I be? So.
Yeah.
And another thing, I wasn't familiar with the country around there, the outskirts of where the reservation was and where Forest Service was and that sort of thing. So I came back to Great Falls and looked around till I found a place where I wanted to live. And
Came home.
been here ever since.
Yeah.
Well, I've moved a couple times within the city, but.
Well, Jean, you've been describing your military service here, and it's been a phenomenal story. I mean, just your steady rise in your nursing capacity and education, and
I know it sounded to me like I was being monotonous.
oh gosh, no. Well, but you also, I mean, when you look back on it, you served through some very momentous times as well, historical times. And so, and it's just been a little over an hour that we've been together here. Is there anything that you want to say in closing, or that you didn't talk about that you'd
there
like
is
to?
one thing I forgot to mention, and it has to do with my second assignment in Korea.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I had dealings with the POWs. I don't know if you remember, but earlier in 1968, the North Koreans had captured a ship called the Pueblo,
Yep.
USS Pueblo. Well, during the following year, an attempt had been made to release them, to get them released through political means or tactful means, and the North Koreans would never agree to anything like that. But just before Christmas, a unstable North Korean government decided they'd release them on Christmas Eve. So they came to our hospital.
Oh.
So we cleared out as many of the patients we had as we could, and put the ones that couldn't be moved or couldn't be discharged or otherwise taken care of in other quarters. And then we received these 100, and I can't remember now if there was 101 or 102 total, but one body was counted in that, and they were all Navy personnel, so the Navy was responsible for moving them from the border down to our hospital. But they all received a complete physical examination with x-rays and whatever other diagnostic measures were indicated, plus whatever treatment was indicated for anything immediate. And then they were given a Christmas Eve dinner, and they spent the night there, and then the next morning the Navy flew them all to the air base, by choppers out to the base, and then they flew them all home. So they got back home in time for another Christmas.
Wow. Wow.
But that was a kind of an unusual experience
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
And I meant to mention that when we talked about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so looking back now, and I'm sorry, what is how old are you now?
97.
You don't look a day over 75. You look marvelous.
Thank you.
But looking back, do you ever look back, or you have to? I'm
All
assuming.
the time.
Yeah, yeah, and think of what your service was and what that meant to you, and
Well, it meant a lot to me when I was doing it, and it does mean a lot to me now to have done that, to have served. I've got good experience. I've met a lot of wonderful people, really wonderful people, that were supervisors or ones that I supervised too, and my equals, my peers in nursing, and seen places that I wouldn't probably ever have seen otherwise.
well, you had a remarkable career, and it was great talking to you this afternoon.
Thank you.
Well, and again,
I don't feel that I really have done anything more than hundreds of others have done, and done more than I have. But I did what I could.
yes. Well, Jean, it was an honor to meet you. It was again, thank you for sitting down with me and sharing your story with the Veterans History Project.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Oh.